You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYFI.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how are you doing today?
Great, thanks.
Are you calling in from home?
Yes, it's one of these occasions. I'm actually in Copenhagen now.
Taking a rest this week, I see.
No, taking a rest in Copenhagen for a few days, then I'm off again.
That sounds good. All right, well, let's jump into it. What market news do you want to start with today? The tariff pause from the EU?
Yeah, I think that's I was about to say the topic of the week came here just before the weekend, the announcement from President Trump that first he would be imposing a 50% tariff on the EU already here from June 1st. And then added news here as of yesterday that, yes, he's still threatening 50% tariffs, but now from July 9th. And as I hope a lot of our viewers can remember, July 9th is actually the end of the 90-day pause on the retaliatory tariffs. To put things further into perspective, the EU was originally slapped with a 20% retaliatory tariff. So the 50% is, of course, substantially more. But what I want to touch on here is not so much, let's call it the negotiation tactics of the U.S. administration. It's more what are the real-life repercussions this is having in the supply chain, irrespective of whether this threat is actually acted upon or not, because it sends two very important messages to all the U.S. importers. One message is that at the end of the 90-day pause, you may or may not face tariffs that are actually higher than was originally stated. So anyone who sat down and said, well, whatever retaliatory tariff, it depended on where you are in the world, but whatever tariff was announced, surely it can't get any worse than this. At worst, it can be re-implemented after the 90 days. The threat on the EU shows, no, it could actually be something even higher. That in itself adds an impetus to get front-loading of cargo prior to the end of the 90 days. That's one thing. I mean, those who can front-load and want to front-load are already doing this. This just adds an added impetus to do more of it. The second thing, which is equally important, is if you thought the 90-day deadline was a hard deadline, apparently we can also think again. Because in the first announcement, that was suddenly changed from July 9th to June 1st, which in practical terms would mean that nobody would be able to get anything moved before June 1st. That would be extremely marginal. Yes, it was then subsequently moved to July 9th, but it very clearly also indicates that the U.S. administration does not feel obligated to live up to these deadlines that they themselves have imposed. And again, this adds impetus to U.S. importers that if they are in the game of front-loading cargo before the deadlines, this put pressure on getting it done as soon as possible and not wait until the deadline, all of which adds to demand in the short term and adds to capacity shortages in the short term. And then with a delay effect will add to potential challenges relating to port congestion and inland congestion in the U.S. It's simply these yo-yo movements up and down that becomes problematic in itself. The undercurrent, and I know we talked about that before, the whole problem for the supply chain is the unpredictability. With the risk of sounding somewhat callous, I would say the global supply chains can basically live with whatever tariff is out there. That doesn't mean they're going to be without cost. They absolutely will be with cost. But if you announce whatever tariff and you know this is the landscape for, say, the next 4 years, supply chains will be adjusted and accommodate whatever the landscape is, and they'll find a way. But the sheer unpredictability is the problem in a supply chain. You can change regulation from day to day, but you can't move supply chains. And this is why we can either look at it and say what comes into law, but because effectively we need to see what comes in customs or what is actually coming out through an executive order. Whatever President Trump is saying on Truth Social does not make it law. We have to wait until that actually is implemented. But as we have seen the pattern emerge, that part of what he's saying then suddenly becomes an executive order from one day to the next. This adds to the uncertainty. Just to give a practical example of how uncertainty is added every day. I saw it this morning. It might have been late Sunday evening U.S. time. Sorry if I didn't see it at that point, but it was over here Monday morning, that now we are also seemingly open for uncertainty in terms of which specific commodities may or may not be tariffed. Because the latest, let's call it, statement from President Trump was that he might not necessarily want the U.S. to see produce textiles and socks. Those were his exact words. He would like to see the U.S. produce military equipment, big things, and things for AI. which again opens a whole new kettle of fish, because right now we have tariff on every country, on every conceivable commodity. Now suddenly there is an open uncertainty in terms of, could these rules in a couple of weeks or a couple of months suddenly be changed? So some commodities are exempt and some are not. This is not something that is actionable by anyone out there. It's not even law yet. But again, it raises this level of uncertainty, and uncertainty in a supply chain equals cost.
Yeah, and it makes it very challenging for anyone that is on a customs team or you're part of an operations team importing or exporting goods, and you have to be up to date with what the latest is and help to advise your other teams that you're working with on what you should do or what you shouldn't do. And that's just, on your micro level with your own company. But then if you're looking at the US government and CBP, you're having to keep track of all the latest tariff changes between commodities. And that's it's a difficult task, to say the least, when you've got thousands and millions maybe of commodity codes. So yeah, that makes it definitely challenging.
Yeah, and you can see that the follow-up. Now we talked on that. This is all on the demand side, but this also has a real and tangible effect on the supply chain. It's only been a couple of weeks ago we talked about how many blank sailings there suddenly was on the Pacific, how much capacity had been taken out of the market. Then we have the reversal on the China tariffs. It took the carriers about a week or so to start rearranging where the ships go, but now it's moving fast. Within a single week alone, the capacity on the Trans-Pacific suddenly increased by 11%. And if I'm looking 3 weeks out in that week, that's an 18% injection of capacity compared to what we just had planned a week ago. So just as rapidly as the carriers could then blank sailings, we're now seeing them rapidly scramble to put capacity back into the trade again.
And where is that capacity coming from? If you're still going to need potentially added capacity going from Europe to the US, where is it all getting pulled from?
Some of it, and that would have to be dug further into, but that would have to come likely from a couple of blank sailings on routes like Asia to Indian subcontinent, Asia, Europe, these kinds of trades. So you're shuffling the ships around, which is also why it's taking a little bit of time. But it does go to show that, again, all these decisions in the supply chain have very rapid and real repercussions, and these things cannot be undone. I mean, the services that were blanked 3 weeks ago didn't sail. That cannot be undone. And this is still the drop in demand we are seeing arrive in the US. This surge we are seeing being loaded now, this surge is not being felt in the US until 3-4 weeks into the future. So all of these things are a lag time. We're seeing yet another yo-yo go up and down with it.
Right. And the vessels can only move so fast.
The vessels can only move so fast, and ports and terminals have an upper limit in terms of capacity. I mean, even the most efficient terminals in the world, they are designed for a good, smooth flow. Of course, they can handle some spikes up and down, but very large spikes, that's what's causing the problems. We have seen in Europe increasing problems with port congestion over the last month and a half. There are now reports coming out from, for example, Drewry in terms of increasing port congestion issues in some of the ports in China, of all places, which is likely caused by this phenomenal surge of cargo that just wants to get to the US right now.
So is that where we're seeing most of the port congestion right now, is over in Asia and China?
No, most of the port congestion right now is in Europe. It has been there for a while. I think a lot of it is a combination of the phase-in of all the new liner shipping networks, which may not have worked as well as hoped when it comes to then handling at the port side. In combination with there has been issues with strikes. There have been some ports that are doing plant maintenance, installing new cranes, which for a temporary period, of course, takes capacity off. You have low water issues in the Rhine River. So it's a confluence of different factors. But the increase in port congestion in China seems more linked to this rapid surge in cargo that wants to get out of China and over to the US ASAP. And if that is any early indication, if this surge can cause port congestion issues in China, it would also seem to imply that this could definitely also cause issues once that surge arrives over stateside.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. There's a lot more automation in the Asian ports, isn't there? So they generally have faster throughput. Is that correct?
Yeah, you say that's a whole other kettle of fish. Automation doesn't necessarily mean you have a higher productivity. I mean, you have examples of automated ports that are not really more productive than, I was about to say, good old-fashioned manual ports if you really have a good labor. What automated terminals tend to do is to make a more smooth operation. You don't get all these peaks and troughs, which is actually also a good thing in itself.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe we should switch gears a bit and talk about the rate developments in the last week. So what are we seeing with the NYFI
Yeah,
spot rate?
what we're seeing with the NYFI is, I was about to say, completely expected, is of course a beginning spike in spot rates, specifically on the route from China over to the US and especially US West Coast. This is where the brunt of it is. We are up something like, I think it was 14% week on week. And the expectation should be that this is only the beginning of the increase. You might look at some of the indices out there that are based on quotes and not an actual cargo loaded. They have increased more, but again, these are quotes. And some of the deep dives I'm beginning to do on some of the NYFI indexes also seems to imply that when the market starts to either go up dramatically or down dramatically, there can be quite a difference between the indices on what is quoted and what is then actually de facto being paid. Conceptually, you can think about if the market is dropping very rapidly, the quotes that are then coming out might actually be higher than what is eventually being paid, because some of those bookings that are made might actually be abandoned by the shippers in favor of lower rates. And you can see the reverse when the rates are then beginning to go up. So the 14% increase we are seeing just in a single week, I see that as only the beginning of what we're going to see here from China to the US over the coming weeks.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because the market's changing, I guess both carriers and shippers have to figure out where the rate is going to land. And so that's going to be a little bit of hit and miss in terms of providing quotes, and then whatever is taken, then that kind of levels it out.
Yeah, exactly. And you can say now that we are on the NYFI, I mean, one of the interesting things is, I mean, last week we talked about the differential if you were sending 20 footers compared to 40 footers. What I found interesting to look at this time is something slightly different, because we're so accustomed to mainly talk about indices that are gauging basically China's US when we talk about the Pacific. But what if we are broadening it out? And I think you have a graph you can share with us where I've tried to look at the price differential. So what we're looking at here is, if we say China to US West Coast is the baseline, then what is the premium you're paying if you're shipping either from Southeast Asia to US West Coast, that's the yellow line, or from Northeast Asia, so that would be, say, for example, Korea, Japan, and if you're shipping that to the US West Coast. And this actually shows quite a number of interesting elements. I mean, if you look at the latest data here from 2025, this is not surprising. Remember, initially, we only had a pause of non-Chinese origins, and we then had the tariff on China. So there was a spike of cargo from non-Chinese origins, and that also caused a spike in how much more did you suddenly have to pay coming from a non-Chinese origin. But if we look back over the 2 years where we got NYFI data, what I find interesting is the premium paid was, let's call it, relatively stable for 2023 and a little bit into 2024. But then as we get into 2024, we see some pretty wild fluctuation. We have a period in early summer where suddenly it becomes extremely cheap to send from, in this case, South Korea and Japan over to US West Coast as compared to China. And then it normalizes. Then we get up to a crescendo and suddenly it becomes very expensive to ship from Northeast Asia compared to China. Then we see a dip in Southeast Asia. So what I'm driving at is almost the same as last week when we talked 20 and 40 foot. If we're used to looking at just these standard China to US rates, the deviations you as a shipper will experience if you are not shipping specifically on that trade lane is not trivial. It can actually be some very dramatic swings depending on the individual trade, which personally I find interesting to start to dive into more of these, I wouldn't say smaller trades, because some of these are definitely not small trades, but broaden out the discussion in terms of what are the rate developments we're seeing in the market. And maybe that also goes away in talking into what, at least I've heard for many, many years from some shippers saying, yeah, we got all these different indices, but that's not quite what we see. Well, sometimes this is actually why there are local circumstances. That means that even if you are on a trade that looks like a standard Pacific trade, it can actually differ. And then the change can be rapid, as we saw in this case, for example, from Northeast Asia over summer 24.
Yeah, I think it's important to get to this level of granularity because not every importer or exporter is using the exact same trade lane. So having that broader index rate might not be as helpful for you. It's just maybe giving you some sort of indication, but it's not quite the truth that you're experiencing. So I think it's interesting that you've been able to pull some of these more granular charts showing us the deltas between the more common trade lanes and getting more specific. Awesome. Are there other news? I know last week we talked about the USTR and there was an update that was going to be happening, a hearing. Was there anything that came out of that that's worth talking about?
Yeah, I mean, the transcript has now been released, and that's not much of a surprise in there. And I think, at least that's my take. I mean, we'll have to wait and see what USTR comes out with eventually and what they end up concluding. But in line with what the brief was for the hearing, this was mainly around the suggested tariffs on port equipment, like, for example, cranes built in China, tariffs on containers, tariffs on chassis and chassis components. And there was quite a bit of input also in terms of what the cost of this would be, how problematic it would be. Will this influence? Maybe. We'll see. But I think for the wider audience also of this podcast, what I think is important to also note is, for now, the baseline assumption should be that what we've heard previously in terms of fees on Chinese operators, in terms of fees on Chinese-built chips, they are highly likely to be implemented more or less as is once we get to October. So we might as well start to get prepared for that.
Okay, so still on track for that. All right. And then any other news maybe around the world or maybe not immediate market news that you want to talk through?
Yeah, I think one thing that might be interesting to bring up, and we've talked a lot about, for example, USTR, and I think in one of our podcasts we also touched upon the Ships for America Act. And one of if you look at the underlying political reasons, let's put aside what they're actually doing. The political motivation behind these, at least one of these stated motivations, is to increase shipbuilding in the US. And it is a fact that very, very limited shipbuilding is taking place in the US compared to how many ships are built in the world. So that's a political aim. But what is interesting to note is the US is not the only one with that political aim. I mean, China had that aim a few decades ago, very successful with it. Korea had that aim even further decades ago, and they were also successful. If we're looking forward, India has the same ambition. I believe right now India is building 0.5% of the world's ships, and they have an ambition to build about 20% of them in 2047. How are they going to go about it? Well, we got a glimpse of that again in the week that just passed, where the Indian government has now indicated they're going to order slightly more than 100 oil tankers at an investment cost of a bit more than 10 billion from Indian shipyards. The intention there is, if you want to increase domestic shipbuilding, you need to place orders with these yards. So basically, the Indian government is going down the same path as we've seen done successfully with China, with South Korea. So if you want to increase your shipbuilding capability, if you want orders to come in, subsidies is one tool with which to do it. I'm not saying it's necessarily the only tool. I'm also not advocating whether this is correct or not from a political vantage point. It simply is. This what is happening. So yes, Indian shipbuilding will increase de facto by virtue of the Indian government now ordering 100 vessels to the tune of $10 billion. And we can then contrast that with the U.S. approach we have seen so far, which is more based on penalizing companies in the hope that that will bring more shipbuilding orders to the U.S., which is a strategy I have a hard time seeing how can compete with other shipbuilding nations with the way it is right now.
Yeah, that's interesting to see the different strategies. Do you know if there's a specific reason behind why they're doing oil tankers versus any other type of ship?
Well, India is dependent on a lot of oil shipments. And as far as I understand, keep in mind, I'm not an oil tanker expert, but what at least I'm led to believe is a lot of the fleet that is servicing India is actually relatively old and also in need of renewal. So from an overall market perspective, it appears to be the right segment they're going for first.
Okay, gotcha. All right, and I think last on the docket here, so the FMC is going to be launching an investigation, so to speak. Could you talk a little bit about what they're going to be looking into and why it matters?
Yeah. You can say in short, what the FMC is doing is, I mean, this is, let's call it a fact-finding mission. It's basically a question in terms of, I might be paraphrasing slightly, so sorry for that if anybody really reads the details, and I would encourage people to do that. But basically, it's a fact-finding mission and saying, well, if we're looking at not only what are the different flag state rules around the world, but also how are these flag states enforcing those same rules, does that provide a commercial disadvantage for U.S. foreign trade? Which in itself, okay, it's a valid question. I would add a couple of comments to it. First of all, part of the answer, I think everybody involved in shipping already knows the answer. Yes, there are definitely flag states that makes it disadvantageous for example, U.S. shipping. I mean, that's part of the reason why we have flags of convenience. This is not a new practice. This has de facto been the case for several centuries. So part of the conclusion, we can already guess what that is going to be.
Can you explain what the flags of convenience are?
Well, there are various different versions of it. You can say in its most benign form, it can offer you tax advantages. You can either say it allows you to evade taxes, or you can say it allows you to optimize taxes. There are many different words for the same thing. Different flag states then have different rules in terms of what kind of manning. US, for example, for a US flag, you need a US crew, which is one of the reasons why, from a cost perspective, it is not competitive, because a US crew is relatively expensive compared to crew from a lot of other countries. So there's a lot of different rules. That's one element of it. Another element is then, given whatever rule a flag state has made, how diligent are they in then enforcing and policing their own rules versus the ships that are flagged in their country? You can say that's the other dimension, where there are also some countries that are much more diligent than others in trying to police that. And in what I would call somewhat a twist of irony, there is a group, the Paris MOU, every year they're trying to rank the flag states, not necessarily in terms of whether they like the rules or not, but in terms of how diligent are the individual nations in policing those rules. And in the FMC's brief, one of the countries that are, this is my interpretation of it, that seems to be put forward as a negative element of a flag of convenience is Malta. Interestingly, if we look at that ranking done by Paris MOU every year in terms of then at least diligently policing own rules, Malta is ranked higher than the US, which I also find to be quite interesting. So this is a study where the nuances might differ, but we already have a reasonable idea what are some of these conclusions going to be. I believe the deadline is in August or something like that. But where this becomes interesting is, let's think back to late 2024. This is when USTR, the US Trade Representative, was given also a fact-finding mission to find out whether there were unfair practices in terms of, for example, shipbuilding and the like. And this is part of what led to this USTR proposal we are now discussing. So not if, but when the FMC finding does come up and say, yes, this is a skewed playing field, because it always has been, what are then the next step? And given what we have seen over the last 4 years, it's almost a foregone conclusion that the next step will be a proposal either through Congress or through an executive order to try to address this imbalance. How that is then going to be done, we simply don't know. But we are almost going to end up this podcast where we started it, in talking about unpredictability. Because right now, from my perspective, it's relatively predictable what the outcome of this analysis is, at least at a high level. The unpredictable part is what action will then be put into motion to try to correct this.
Definitely. Yeah, we're in for an interesting summer, I would say, with all of the different factors going on. We've got, tariff deadlines happening in July, this in August. So we'll definitely have a lot to talk about over the course of the next few months. Oh, yeah. All right. Well, I think that's everything for today. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back next week. And until then, happy shipping.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by Nice Shacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.